Clay Landry was a dead man walking. He just didn't have the good sense to lie down yet. For 2 years he'd haunted the small cabin at the edge of the Wyoming Territory, a place where the wind whispered the names of his dead wife and daughter. Clara. Annie. He moved like a man wading through thick mud, each day a slow, pointless struggle. He chopped wood he didn't need. He mended fences no one would ever see. He was waiting to die. He just didn't know it. Then, he saw the wagon. It was a smudge of dust on the horizon, growing bigger, rolling down a trail that hadn't seen a visitor in over a year. Clay didn't move from his porch rocker. He just watched, his hand resting near the rifle propped against the wall. A woman was driving, small, shoulders slumped, a wide-brimmed hat hiding her face. 2 kids were tucked beside her, a boy, maybe 10, with eyes that saw too much, and a little girl, maybe 5, thumb stuck in her mouth, clutching a raggedy doll. They didn't belong here. This was a place for endings, not new beginnings. The wagon groaned to a stop. The woman looked up at him, and her eyes held no fear. Just a deep, settled desperation that was older than the road she'd traveled. "You lost?" Clay's voice was rust. She shook her head. "No, sir. We came to find you." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Me? Your name's Clay Landry?" He almost said no. "Used to be." She climbed down, her legs shaking from the long ride. "My name's Ruthie Holloway. These are my children, Luke and Susie." She said the names like a prayer. "I was married to a man named Daniel." Clay froze. Daniel Holloway. A name from another lifetime. A good man he'd served with in the war. A man who died on a frozen river in Tennessee. A man he hadn't thought about in years. He was a good man, Clay managed. Ruthie's hands trembled as she gripped the side of the wagon. "Before he died, he wrote me a letter. He said if I was ever in real trouble, I should find you. He said you'd help." Clay felt the air leave his lungs. That was a lifetime ago. He wasn't that man anymore. That man was buried on the hill behind the cabin, right next to his family. "I ain't who I used to be," he said, his voice flat. She took a step closer, and her gaze was so direct it felt like a brand. "They don't need who you used to be," she said, nodding toward the kids. "They need someone now." He should have said no. He should have turned his back and walked inside. But he looked at the little girl, with her tangled hair and her worn-out doll. And he saw a ghost of his own, Annie. And that broke something inside him that he thought was already shattered beyond repair. He stepped off the porch. "I got a spare room," he grunted. "It's not much." Ruthie let out a breath she'd been holding for 1,000 miles. "It's more than we had yesterday." That night, after the kids were asleep on pallets on the floor, Clay sat on his porch. He wasn't thinking about the past anymore. He was thinking about a promise made by a dead man, and a woman who had crossed hell to collect on it. For the first time in 2 years, the silence of the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. And he had a terrible feeling he knew what it was watching for. Because Ruthie Holloway hadn't just been running from something. She had been running to him. And whatever she was bringing with her was still out there, in the dark, and it was coming. The cabin had a new rhythm. It was the sound of a broom sweeping floors that hadn't been swept in years. The smell of stew bubbling on the stove. The quiet patter of small feet. Clay wasn't used to it. The life inside his home felt fragile, like a soap bubble he was afraid to touch. The boy, Luke, was the first one up each morning. He'd sit by the stove, silent, watchful, his eyes tracking Clay's every move. He didn't act like a 10-year-old. He acted like a soldier on watch. "You know how to work?" Clay asked him one morning. Luke met his gaze without flinching. "When I have to." The boy was a natural. He split wood, hauled water, checked the hen house without being asked. He was quiet, but his hands were always busy, and his eyes were always scanning the tree line, always looking for trouble. One day, Clay was repairing a corral fence, and Luke was helping, hammering nails with a steady, determined rhythm. "You got family?" Luke asked, his voice low. "Not anymore," Clay said. The boy didn't say anything else, but Clay could feel him watching. He started to see the signs. The way Luke never let his little sister, Susie, out of his sight. The way he flinched if Clay's voice got too loud. The way Ruthie would check the locks on the door 3-4 times before bed. This wasn't just a family down on their luck. This was a family on the run. One evening, after the kids were asleep, he finally asked her. They were on the porch, nursing mugs of weak coffee. You gonna tell me what really happened back in Bridger? Ruthie stared out into the darkness, her arms wrapped tight around herself. There was a man, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Walter Griggs, our landlord. She told him about the rent, about the late-night visits, about the locked doors. Then her voice broke. He started waiting for Luke to be gone. He'd come inside when I was alone with Susie. He told me he'd take her if I didn't do what he wanted. Clay's hands tightened around his mug until his knuckles were white. He knew the type. Vultures who preyed on the weak. He'd seen them his whole life. But there was something else. He could see it in the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. The way her body was coiled tight, even now. Ruthie was holding something back. A secret even bigger than the monster she'd run from. And he was starting to think that whatever it was, Luke knew it too. That night, long after the cabin was dark, Clay saw the boy slip outside. He followed him quietly to the barn. Luke was crouched in the dirt, drawing with a stick. It was a map. The cabin, the barn, the well, the tree line. Every possible angle of attack. Expecting trouble? Clay asked softly. Luke didn't even look up. Just like to be ready. Clay didn't laugh. He knelt beside the boy, a cold knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't just about being ready. This was about knowing, with absolute certainty, that the trouble was coming. A few days later, he saw Ruthie go into the woods alone. He followed at a distance. She wasn't praying. She was practicing. She'd pulled a small revolver from her dress and was aiming it at a tree, her hands shaking but her eyes filled with a terrifying resolve. She wasn't just running from Walter Griggs. She was preparing to kill him. And Clay Landry, the man who wanted nothing more to do with the world, was standing right in the middle of her war. He just didn't know the darkest secret of all. The reason Griggs would never, ever stop hunting them. The first real warning came on the back of a black horse. Jack Bellamy, an old friend Clay hadn't seen in years, rode up the trail looking grim. Heard you had company, Jack said, skipping the pleasantries. He looked from Clay to the cabin, where Ruthie was watching from the window. You hear about a man named Griggs? Clay's body went rigid. What about him? He's been in Pine Hollow, asking questions, showing a picture of a woman and 2 kids. The sheriff ain't interested, but Griggs has money. Money makes folks listen. Jack leaned forward in his saddle. A man like that doesn't just ask questions, Clay. He's looking for something he thinks is his. You better be ready. I'm always ready, Clay said, but the words felt hollow. After Jack left, the feeling of being watched became a physical presence. One afternoon, while checking his trap lines, Clay found them. Hoof prints. A single rider, keeping to the trees, circling the property. Watching the cabin, waiting. He didn't tell Ruthie. He just cleaned his rifle and put extra rounds in the box by the door. She knew anyway. He saw her shadow at the window that night, staring out into the suffocating darkness. The tension in the cabin was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Luke stopped sleeping. He'd sit in the corner of the main room, whittling a stick into a sharp point, his young face a mask of concentration. Then, the dog started barking. A frantic, terrified sound that cut through the dead of night. Clay was out the door in a second, rifle in hand. The barking grew more desperate, then stopped. Just stopped. The silence that followed was 100 times worse. Clay moved toward the barn, every nerve screaming. He found the dog lying in the dirt. Its neck had been twisted, a clean, brutal break. There was no blood. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. I can get this close whenever I want. He sat by the window until dawn, his rifle across his lap, his eyes burning holes into the tree line. He was no longer just helping a family in need. He was a sentry guarding a fort that was already under siege. The next morning, Ruthie came to him. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a hard, brittle guilt. "There's something else," she said, her voice shaking. "Something you have to know. About Susie." Clay waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat. "She's not Daniel's," Ruthie whispered, and the words seemed to suck all the air from the room. She's Griggs's." The world tilted on its axis. "He forced me," she said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Months before Daniel died. Daniel never knew. After he was gone, Griggs came back. He said Susie was his. He said she was proof that I was his." Rage, cold and pure, flooded through Clay. It wasn't at Ruthie. It was at the man who would do that. The man who was hunting them not for money, not for revenge, but for possession. "He'll come for her," Clay said, his voice a low growl. "He won't stop." "I know," Ruthie sobbed. "And he won't stop until one of us is in the ground." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. But Clay saw something else in their depths. It wasn't just fear. It was a promise. She had brought this war to his doorstep, and now he knew why. She wasn't looking for a protector. She was looking for a partner. And the battle had just begun. From that moment on, every hour was borrowed time. Clay became a different man. The ghost that haunted the cabin was gone, replaced by a hunter. He reinforced the locks, boarded up the back windows, and taught Luke how to load and fire the rifle. The boy learned fast, his small hands steady, his eyes cold and focused. He never asked why. He just knew. They took shifts at night, one of them always awake, always watching. Clay hated the fear that clung to the cabin like wood smoke, but he hated what it was doing to Ruthie even more. She was shrinking, folding in on herself, the weight of her secret and the constant threat crushing the life out of her. Then Jack Bellamy rode in again, and this time, his lip was split, and his eye was swelling shut. "It's worse than I thought," he said, spitting blood into the dirt. "Griggs has bought the damn sheriff. He's coming, Clay. Not just him. He's got 2 hired guns with him, and he's got papers." Clay's blood ran cold. "Papers?" "From a judge up in Cheyenne. Says Ruthie kidnapped his child. Says he has a legal right to take her." "She's not his," Clay growled. Jack shrugged, the movement pained. "The law says she is. And if you stand in his way, if you shoot him, they'll hang you." The world was closing in. There was nowhere to run. The law, the one thing that was supposed to protect people like Ruthie, had been turned into a weapon against them. "Let me get you out of here," Jack pleaded. "I know people, places you can hide." But when Clay told her, Ruthie just shook her head, a strange calm settling over her. "I'm tired of running." That night she vanished. Clay woke to a cold draft from the open front door. Her coat was gone. The kids were still asleep in their beds. He grabbed his rifle and searched the property, his heart pounding with a new kind of terror. He called her name until his throat was raw. Nothing. The woods were silent. He thought Griggs had gotten her. He thought she'd given up. He was wrong. She returned just before dawn, her dress torn and her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes were on fire. "I found his camp," she said, her voice breathless but strong. "South Ridge, by the old quarry. It's him and the 2 others." Clay stared at her, stunned. "You went alone?" "I had to know," she said. "He told me he was coming for Susie. He said if I gave her up, he'd let the rest of us live." She met Clay's eyes, and the fear was gone, replaced by something harder than steel. "I told him I'd see him in hell before he ever laid a hand on her." Something inside Clay, something that had been dead for 2 years, roared back to life. This woman wasn't just brave. She was a warrior. She had faced the monster in his den and walked away. "We need a plan," he said, his voice tight. Ruthie leaned in close, the smell of pine and cold night air on her clothes. "I have one." And it wasn't a plan of defense. It was a plan of attack. It was simple, brutal, and it relied on one thing: Griggs's arrogance. He wouldn't expect them to fight back. He would expect them to cower. They were going to use that to kill him. 2 days later, the trap was sprung. The air was still and cold. The sky a flat, gray sheet. Ruthie rode out into the meadow in front of the cabin, a white cloth tied to her saddle. She looked small, defeated, alone. But she wasn't. Luke was in the barn loft, the rifle resting on a bale of hay, his eyes sighted down the barrel. Jack Bellamy was hidden in the rocks on the ridge above, a shotgun loaded with buckshot across his knees, and Clay was pressed against the back wall of the cabin, hidden in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. Griggs and his men rode in slow, confident. Griggs was smiling, a smug, possessive look on his face. He saw Ruthie, alone and vulnerable, and thought he'd already won. "Knew you'd come to your senses, girlie," he called out, dismounting. "You can't fight a man like me." Ruthie played her part perfectly. She sobbed, pleaded, said he could take Susie, but begged him to let her say goodbye first. It was all he needed to hear. He took a step toward the cabin, his guard down completely. That's when the world exploded. Jack's shotgun roared from the ridge, the blast echoing across the valley. One of the hired guns was thrown from his saddle, his chest a bloody ruin. Before the second man could even draw his pistol, the sharp crack of the rifle sounded from the barn. Luke's shot hit the man square in the gut, doubling him over with a strangled cry. Griggs spun around, his face a mask of shock and fury. He saw the smoke from the ridge, the man clutching his stomach, and then he saw Clay, stepping out from the shadows of the cabin, his rifle leveled, his eyes as cold as the grave. "Don't!" Griggs sneered, his hand hovering over his own gun. "You shoot me, Landry, and the law will hunt you down like a dog. They'll hang you." Clay took another step forward, the rifle never wavering. "You ever see what thunder looks like from the inside?" Then he pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. Griggs stumbled back, a look of pure disbelief on his face, before collapsing into a heap in the dirt. Dead. A profound silence fell over the meadow, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Ruthie slid from her horse, her knees giving way. Clay went to her, pulling her into his arms. She didn't cry. She just took a long, shuddering breath, the first free breath she'd taken in years. They buried the bodies that night, deep in the woods, with no markers. When the sheriff finally rode out a week later, asking questions, Clay and Ruthie told him a story of self-defense. Jack backed them up. Even Luke, with his old man's eyes, told the story without a flicker of doubt. The sheriff, maybe knowing what kind of man Griggs was, or maybe just not wanting the paperwork, didn't push it. The immediate danger was gone. But Clay knew, deep in his bones, that killing a man like Griggs wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Because men like that have friends, they have family, and they leave ghosts behind that are sometimes more dangerous than the men themselves. The peace that followed was a fragile thing. For a few weeks the cabin felt like a home. Ruthie stopped looking over her shoulder. Luke even laughed a few times, a real, honest sound that startled Clay. Susie slept through the night, no longer waking from nightmares of a monster in the dark. But Clay couldn't sleep. At night, he'd see Griggs's face, that look of shock just before the bullet hit. He didn't feel guilt. He felt relief. And that scared him more than anything. He'd killed a man, and some part of him, a part he didn't want to admit existed, had felt a grim satisfaction in the act. "You regret it?" Ruthie whispered to him one night, finding him staring out the window. "No," he said, and the honesty of it was a lead weight in his gut. "Then what's haunting you?" He couldn't tell her. He couldn't explain that the violence had woken something up inside him, something he'd buried with his wife and daughter. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a killer. And he was terrified he might be good at it. The outside world wasn't finished with them either. Sheriff Daly rode out one morning, his face grim. "The judge," he said, "the one who signed Griggs's papers up in Cheyenne. He's dead. Poisoned." Clay and Ruthie exchanged a look. This was bigger than one corrupt landlord. "There's talk," Daly continued, "that Griggs was part of something bigger. A whole network. Land fraud, blackmail. Worse. The governor's office is sending men to investigate. They're gonna be asking questions." The loose threads were starting to unravel, and they were tied directly to Clay's front door. 2 weeks later, he arrived. Not a local lawman, but a deputy U.S. Marshal from back east. He wore a clean suit and had an accent that didn't belong in Wyoming. He stood on their porch, his eyes cold and assessing. "We have reason to believe Mr. Griggs was involved in a criminal enterprise," the marshal said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "And we have questions about the child, Susie. If she is biologically his, as the court papers claimed, his estate may have a legal claim." Ruthie went pale. "She's not," Clay said, stepping in front of her. The marshal raised an eyebrow. "The law may require proof of that, Mr. Landry. We'll need you and Mrs. Holloway to come to Cheyenne to give a formal deposition, willingly, or with a warrant." The threat hung in the air. They were being pulled into the very system that had failed them, a system that could still tear them apart. They had a week. The days that followed were a quiet hell. Ruthie barely spoke. Luke went back to being a silent watchdog. They rode into Cheyenne a week later, leaving Luke and the farm in Jack's care. The city was a cage of noise and people. The courtroom was cold and impersonal. Ruthie told her story first, her voice shaking but clear. Then it was Clay's turn. He hated every second of it, laying his life bare for strangers to judge. He told them how Griggs came with guns, how he tried to take a child, and how he, Clay Landry, had stopped him. When he was done, the room was silent. The judge, a woman with tired but intelligent eyes, looked at them for a long time. "You could have run," she said. "We did run," Ruthie replied, her voice ringing with passion. "And it almost destroyed us. We had nowhere left to run." The judge nodded slowly. Then she did something no one expected. She cleared the courtroom and asked to speak to Susie. Alone. Clay's heart stopped. But a few minutes later, the doors opened. Susie ran to Ruthie, her face bright. "What did you tell her?" Ruthie whispered. Susie looked up. "I told her you loved me." That was it. They had won. A stamped piece of paper declared them free. They rode out of Cheyenne that same day and never looked back. But as they crested the last ridge and saw the cabin nestled in the valley below, a place that was finally, truly their home, Clay saw a rider waiting for them by the road. It was Jack, and he was holding a letter. "This came for you," Jack said, his face unreadable. "It's from a man named Thomas Griggs." Clay's blood turned to ice. Walter Griggs had a brother, and he had their address. The letter wasn't a threat. It was something far worse. It was a lie, wrapped in the language of grief and justice. Thomas Griggs claimed he didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth. He claimed Walter had been manipulated, that he had been led to believe Susie was his child by a desperate woman, by Ruthie. The letter was full of subtle poison, painting Ruthie not as a victim, but as a schemer who had used Clay to murder her former lover. It was designed to do one thing: plant a seed of doubt. And it worked. Clay looked at Ruthie, the letter trembling in his hand. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen when she was hiding her first secret. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "It's a lie," she said, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. "Then look at me and say it." She couldn't. The trust they had built, the bond forged in blood and fear, began to crack. He had killed for her. He had faced down the law for her. And now, he wondered if he had been a fool. The quiet peace of their home evaporated, replaced by a tense, bitter silence. They moved around each other like strangers, the unspoken accusation hanging between them. Luke saw it. The boy's watchful eyes darted between them, the hope that had started to grow in him withering away. A week later, another rider came up the trail. This one was tall and lean, with the same cold eyes as his brother. He introduced himself as Jeremiah Griggs. "My brother Thomas is emotional," Jeremiah said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I'm not. I'm a businessman. I believe there has been a great misunderstanding. And I have proof that can clear all this up. Proof that Walter was being blackmailed. Proof that will free your family from this forever." He was smooth. Plausible. He said all the right things. Ruthie, desperate for a way out, wanted to believe him. Clay saw a snake, plain and simple. They argued that night, voices low and sharp in the dark cabin. "You can't trust him!" Clay hissed. "What choice do we have?" Ruthie shot back. "Do you want this hanging over us forever? Over Susie?" Jeremiah was supposed to bring his proof the next day. But that night, Clay woke to the smell of smoke. The barn was on fire. Flames clawed at the night sky, devouring the structure, destroying their winter supplies, everything they had worked to rebuild. Clay and Jack fought the blaze, but it was too late. It had been set, deliberately. And when the sun came up, casting a grim light on the smoldering ruins, they found something else. Jeremiah Griggs was gone, vanished without a trace. The fire had been a diversion. But for what? The weight of it all came crashing down on Clay. The lies, the fire, the brother who appeared and disappeared like a phantom. He looked at Ruthie, standing amidst the ashes of their barn, her face a mask of despair. The doubt, the anger, it all melted away, replaced by a terrible certainty. They were being played. All of them. "This isn't about Susie anymore," Clay said. "It never was. Someone had wanted the barn burned. Someone had wanted Jeremiah gone. And someone was manipulating them, pulling their strings from the shadows. The trust between him and Ruthie had been shattered. Their home was in ruins, and the real enemy hadn't even shown his face yet." In that broken place, with the smell of smoke still thick in the air, Clay made a choice. He walked to Ruthie and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. "No more secrets," he said. "From now on, we face this together, or we lose everything." She looked up at him, tears tracking paths through the soot on her cheeks, and nodded. Hope flickered between them, faint but real. They had to find the truth. Not the truth according to the Griggs brothers, but the real story. And they had a feeling it was buried somewhere on this very land. They started searching the ashes of the barn, and under a charred floorboard, in a small metal box that had been protected from the worst of the flames, they found it. A different set of papers. Not land deeds, not legal claims. It was a birth ledger. And next to Susie's name, under the column for father, it didn't say Walter Griggs or Daniel Holloway. It listed a name that made Clay's blood run cold. Jack Bellamy. The world stopped, the wind died. The birds went silent. Clay stared at the name, the looping script seeming to burn itself into his eyes. Jack, his friend, the man who had warned him, who had fought beside him, who had held his family together while he was gone. It didn't make sense. None of it. He looked up at Ruthie. Her face was a canvas of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrible understanding. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." But it was. The pieces clicked into place with sickening speed. Jack, always there, always helpful. Jack, who knew so much about Griggs's movements. Jack, who had just happened to have the letter from the brother. He hadn't been helping them. He had been managing them, controlling the chaos he himself had created. Walter Griggs hadn't been the monster. He'd been a pawn. He was after the land, yes, but Jack had used Griggs's obsession with Susie, a child he only thought was his, to get him out of the way. Jeremiah wasn't a real brother. He was likely another hired hand, brought in to sow dissent and burn the barn to destroy the very evidence they now held. Jack wanted the land, and he wanted his daughter. He had planned to let Griggs do the dirty work, let Clay be the triggerman, and then, when the dust settled, he would step in to comfort the grieving widow and finally claim what he believed was his. "He's been playing us," Clay said, his voice flat and dead. "All of it. From the very beginning." The betrayal was absolute. It was deeper than any bullet wound. As the truth settled over them, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. It was Jack, riding up the trail with a concerned look on his face, a sack of supplies slung over his saddle. The good friend, coming to help them rebuild. Clay looked at Ruthie. Her eyes were hard as flint. The time for fear was over. The time for running was over. This was the end of the line. Clay tucked the ledger into his shirt and walked out to meet him, Ruthie right behind him. "Jack," Clay said, his voice calm. Too calm. "Clay. Ruthie. I brought some things from town. Figured you could use." Jack's voice trailed off as he saw their faces. The smiles, the friendly concern, it all melted away, replaced by a cold, calculating watchfulness. He knew they knew. "It's over, Jack," Clay said. Jack swung down from his horse, his hand dropping casually to the pistol on his hip. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Susie," Ruthie said, her voice shaking with rage. "You used your own daughter as bait. You let that man terrorize her, terrorize us, just to get what you wanted." A flicker of something, regret? No, annoyance, crossed Jack's face. Griggs was a means to an end. He was going to take everything. I did what I had to do. For us. For her. She's my daughter, Ruthie. She deserves a father, a real home. This place. "This place is built on my family's graves," Clay said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "And you were going to add us to the collection." Jack's eyes hardened. "It didn't have to be this way. You could have just been the hero, Clay. You could have walked away." "I'm done walking away." The world narrowed to the space between the two men. There would be no more letters, no more judges, no more lies. This would be settled here and now, in the dirt, under the wide Wyoming sky. Jack went for his gun. He was fast. But Clay was faster. He wasn't the grieving ghost anymore. He was the man who had been forged in the fires of loss and betrayal. His gun was in his hand, the hammer cocked, before Jack's had even cleared the leather. A single shot echoed through the valley. Jack crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with the same shock Clay had seen on Walter Griggs's face. The shock of a man whose plans had finally, fatally, come apart. Clay stood over him, the smoke curling from the barrel of his gun. He felt nothing. Not relief, not anger. Just a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had fought the monsters, only to find the worst one had been calling him friend all along. Ruthie came and stood beside him, taking his hand. They looked at each other, not as survivors, but as partners. The secrets were all out now, washed clean by blood and truth. The morning came, cold and clear. The light spilled across the valley, across the rebuilt cabin and the graves on the hill. Clay sat on the porch, watching Luke teach Susie how to skip stones across the creek. Their laughter was the only sound. Ruthie brought him a mug of coffee and sat beside him, their shoulders touching. They didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing left to say. They had been through the fire and come out the other side, scarred and changed, but whole, together. He was no longer the man who had lost everything. He was the man who had found something to fight for. A family, pieced together from broken parts. A home, built on a foundation of hard-won peace. A future, not free from ghosts, but no longer haunted by them. The West was still wide and wild, full of dangers seen and unseen. But for the first time in a very long time, Clay Landry looked out at the horizon and wasn't afraid of what the day would bring. He was ready for it. If you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what secrets are buried in the past, just waiting to be uncovered.